New York City public schools switched to all remote as of today, and Boston has been remote for about a month now, with the exception of high-need students who started back in person this week. Both cities' mayors say rising COVID-19 rates have just made it too dangerous to carry on with in-person instruction for now. But others, like Massachusetts governor and education commissioner, say pulling kids out of the classroom is not the answer.
School is the best place for our kids to be. Several scientific studies have shown that COVID transmission in schools is low, even for schools and communities that have higher rates of COVID.
We've created ways to safely return to school through our extensive health and safety guidance. We need to continue to work hard to keep as many students in school learning as possible.
Over the past few weeks, state officials have been pushing to get as many students back into classrooms as possible, although even the CDC now lists in-person learning as a high-risk activity on its website. And at this point, a new survey finds parents actually rate full remote and hybrid setups more highly than they do full in-person setups, even as they anticipate the likely negative impacts on their kids when it comes to academics, mental health, and social skills. But there are also some pretty big disparities in the options being offered to different groups of people, with divides along racial and economic lines. And overall, more parents than ever are worried about their kids falling behind. The man behind these findings is the president of the MassINC Polling Group, Steve Koczela, who joins me now. Steve, thanks for being here.
Glad to do it.
Let's start with the very big picture breakdown that you came up with in this survey about how many people are learning in the three ways that kids are learning nowadays: in-person, remote, and hybrid. What did you find?
Yeah, that was one of the things we set out to do in the survey, was some very basic documentation just of who's doing what. You know, who's in person, which was the most unusual at just 11% of parents saying that one of their children was in person. Hybrid and remote were much more common, each with 46% saying that they had a child doing one of those two. And then we were also looking to document things like how many people are doing pods, how many people have hired a tutor, changed schools, all these kind of basic things that there just hasn't been data out there on. You know, we've seen the coverage and sort of anecdotal coverage of you know, some of the ups and downs of each model, but really didn't even know the basic, just who's doing what at this point.
I'll confess, if I had to guess how many people were going in person, for example, I probably would have put the number higher, just because I've heard Governor Baker say so many times in person is the right way for kids to be learning. There's no risk here. But obviously, I would have been wrong. Let me ask you about pods and some of the other stuff a bit later in this conversation. But I want to talk first about the breakdown, because for different groups of people, as I just mentioned at the start, different groups of people are experiencing these different setups in very different ways. Let's start with the breakdown of people who are learning remotely. Can you talk us through how that varies when it comes to demographics, when it comes to racial and ethnic identity, and also income?
Yeah, that's right, Adam. There are some very big differences on demographics in terms of who's doing remote versus hybrid, of course, the two most common formats. Remote, some of the big urban school districts are doing remote only. This means that you see big disparities in terms of race and ethnicity, big disparities in terms of socioeconomic status as far as who is fully remote. So, for instance, Black parents, Latino parents, households making under $75,000 total in household income are much more likely to be fully remote. Whereas when you look at the parents who are more likely to say that their children are in hybrid school, it's basically the opposite. It tends to be higher income families, both Black parents and white parents, just much more likely to say that they're in hybrid, that their children are in hybrid schooling.
Which, in a way, it seems to me like this is both a descriptive and possibly a prescriptive data point. On the one hand, it maybe shouldn't be a surprise that given some of the hardest hit communities in the state, Chelsea, Revere, East Boston, that you would see lower earning Latino families inordinately affected by that. But at the same time, if these distributions are unequal when it comes to different groups of people, then if you believe that there are pluses and minuses to different types of learning, that has tremendous implications for what we do moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we also looked at is just, okay, here's who's doing what, but also how's it going? And how do you think it's impacting your child? And one of the really interesting and kind of surprising things that we found in this survey is that the ratings that parents gave to hybrid schooling were actually considerably worse than the ones given to full remote. So I think for a bunch of reasons, parents aren't necessarily eager to get into the hybrid model. It's not the case where, being in school more is necessarily better in parents' minds than being in school less, physically in school, I mean.
We have a graphic made up that shows one of the data points. It involves parents being concerned about their kids falling behind in these different configurations of learning. 31% of parents whose kids are in hybrid say that they're worried about their children falling behind. For remote only, it's a bit lower, 27%, and for in-person, it's 17%. But as you mentioned, there are other data points that show how people feel about hybrid learning. Do any ones spring to mind that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, the one that you just noted, I mean, the real interesting thing about that chart was just the gap, how big of a jump there was in terms of parents who are doing hybrid that see an increase in the likelihood that their children are falling behind. That's also something that we saw when we compared our data to national data. That same basic pattern showed up. And then the other thing that we looked at was other impacts. So academic impacts, mental health, your impacts on, your social well-being and so forth. And in each case and across different demographic groupings, the perception among parents was worse for hybrid learner for kids in the hybrid model than it was for kids in a fully remote model.
What do you attribute that to? And this is outside the parameters of the poll, but I have two kids who are learning hybrid right now, and I still cannot remember which days they're going to school on and which days they are at home. They need to remind me, or my wife needs to remind me. And I bring that up. I mean, it shows that I'm, not great when it comes to remembering details, but I think it also shows how difficult it is for kids and family to get in a rhythm when it comes to the hybrid setup. They're learning at home one day in a very different way than they're used to learning. Then they're going to school. Then they're doing it again. Do you think that might be part of the discontent or concern when it comes to hybrid learning?
I think it's very possible. I mean, one of the things that we did kind of rule out is that it's not that hybrid parents are more blaming the school. They actually give the schools pretty good marks and the teachers pretty good marks in terms of saying that they're doing the best they can. But you identified one of the sort of working theories. The other one is really the amount of asynchronous learning that comes along with the hybrid model. A lot of school districts, when you're in a hybrid model, but you're on your off week, you're not in school, you're not in front of a teacher on the screen full time. Whereas if you're fully remote, there's at least some level of interaction and supervision that happens. We don't really know, and that's one of the reasons why I'm glad that we're going to do a couple more rounds of this. And I think digging into that hybrid experience more is one of the things we really want to do. One
other disparity I want to get to before I ask you about questions that you'd like to answer moving forward and implications of this data for policymakers. The perception of the downside of the way kids are learning now, again, varied remarkably across different demographic groups. My understanding, my big takeaway is that higher income and white parents were way more likely to be worried about everything from academic consequences to social consequences for their kids learning the way they are now. Latinos tended to be less worried, I think, on most fronts, and then Black respondents were less worried still, for the most part. Is my characterization there fair, Steve?
Yeah, it is. And the thing that I think we need to keep in mind for this whole thing is really that what we're talking about here is really perception and expectation, and those two things kind of feed off one another. What do you expect the school in this year to provide? What's important to you? The very main thing that's important to the most parents is the health and safety of their children, when we ask that question. So we just have to keep in mind that we're asking parents to compare, what they perceive is going on with what they expected to be going on. and each parent brings their own set of calculations to that question. We're not yet looking at things like assessment data or performance data. It may well turn out to be, for instance, that hybrid learning really was better in terms of just the straight academics than remote learning. But what we're looking at here at this point is just what parents perceive is going on and what did they expect and how do those things compare.
Given that this is perception focused, as you just mentioned, are there any clear takeaways, do you think, for policymakers in the data that you've assembled so far? Or is this a first set of numbers which will help people make policy moving forward when combined with more research that you and others will do down the road?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things I think that policymakers can feel good about that show that the interventions that have taken place have actually made a difference. So my hope is that this will spur kind of further reaction and proactive kind of response. You know, one of the things really was all the effort that was put into being sure that kids had enough devices to do the online schooling that they needed to do really does seem to have moved the needle on just overall access and then the likelihood that kids actually are able to participate in class. Those things improved in this poll over last. So going forward, I think the real things to try to understand and to do something about or figure out is what is this disconnect on hybrid and how can we make that experience the best we possibly can? Because although full-time in person may be the best academically, at this moment it is still a very small minority of kids who have access to that. So being able to improve the experience for kids the overwhelming majority of kids who are doing either hybrid or remote feels like something that this data can help with.
On that somewhat upbeat note, Steve Koczela, thank you for being here. I was going to say coming in, but you didn't come in. We talked via Zoom like everyone talks nowadays.
Someday soon, Adam.
Good to see you, and thank you for talking this through with me.
Thank you, Adam.